Hey guys, tonight we're wandering somewhere hot, really hot. Imagine yourself standing in the middle of an ancient Persian desert. The air is thick, the sand is glowing like it wants to set your sandals on fire, and there's no breeze, only the occasional cruel gust that somehow makes things worse. Your lips are dry, your back is damp, even your shadow seems exhausted. And then someone hands you a bowl, cold, frosty on the bottom. Inside, something smooth, laced with rose water and lime. A crunch of frozen vermicelli. You blink, you sniff, you take a bite. It's ice cream. In the desert, in ancient Persia. And you, dear listener, probably won't survive this kind of temperature without an HVAC unit and a personal hydration pack. Yet, here we are, centuries ago, in one of the hottest regions on Earth, watching people not only survive but indulge in frozen desserts like it's no big deal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere hot or cold, drop your location and local time in the comments I read, all of them. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a dusty path at the edge of a sprawling oasis. The sand crunches beneath your sandals, and palm trees sway lazily nearby like they've never heard of a rush hour. Somewhere off in the distance you hear a donkey bray a flute playing a minor scale, and the soft clink of clay pots being stacked. This is ancient Persia, and unlike most places in the ancient world, the people here aren't just surviving the climate, they're actively challenging it. They have a secret weapon, a trick up their embroidered sleeves. And you're about to step into one of the weirdest, most wonderful paradoxes of early engineering, because in this desert, where shade feels like salvation, someone decided it would be a great idea to make ice. Not just for medicine or rituals, but for pleasure. And it wasn't a one-off miracle. It was a system, one that stretched across dynasties, deserts, and social classes. Where the elite cooled their wine, the poor bartered frozen fruit slush, and couriers delivered snow like Uber Eats for emperors. You approach a low structure in the distance. It's bulbous and alien-looking, like a cross between an igloo and a beehive. This, you're told, is a yakhchal, literally an ice pit. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That's coming up in a bit. Right now, you're more interested in how people even thought to try storing snow here in the first place. Historians still argue whether it was inspired by highland rituals, borrowed from Mesopotamian clay coolers, or just one clever farmer tired of tepid tea. Either way, the idea spread, slowly, steadily, like the evening shadow creeping across a palace courtyard. What we know for sure is that by the time of the Achaemenid Empire, think 500 BCE-ish, Persians weren't just freezing water in winter, they were planning for summer ice months in advance. Imagine that. In a time without thermometers, weather forecasts, or electricity, people were storing literal ice in quantities big enough to serve entire feasts months later, all under the desert sun. That's like knitting a scarf in July and pulling it out pristine in December, except the scarf melts if you mess up. You walk past market stalls stacked with melons, pomegranates, and bunches of mint bundled with twine. The air smells of dust dates and something sour-sweet, a fermented drink, perhaps chilling, in a cracked glaze jar. Someone offers you a cup. You sip. It's tangy, cold, and glorious. Yes, cold. How? Because right now, behind that fruit seller's tent, buried beneath layers of mud brick and geometry, lies an entire culture of cold. A system powered not by wires, but by wind shadow and engineering, centuries ahead of its time. There's a local joke whispered in the alleys of Old Yazd, where the desert heat wraps you like a tortilla. Only a Persian would look at the sun and say, "You know what we need here, ice?" And they did. Because chilling your drink wasn't just about comfort. It was about status, control, and timing. Ice became a symbol not of survival, but of luxury, of empire, of mastery over a brutal climate. You sit on a worn stone bench as twilight paints the desert in hues of pink and purple. The wind cools just a little. Someone lights a small oil lamp nearby. You take another bite of your falude. The vermicelli has softened. The sweetness lingers. The chill feels impossible. But it isn't. Not here. Not in a land where ancient architects carved winter into mud brick, buried it underground, and served it on silver trays beneath the stars. You step closer to the strange dome in the distance, its curved silhouette rising like a mirage from the earth. It looks oddly out of place. No doors, no smoke, no people coming in or out. Just this massive, mud-colored cone squatting in the middle of nowhere. This is your first glimpse of a yakhchal. The name sounds a bit like you're sneezing mid-sentence, but it's nothing to sneeze at. A yakhchal isn't just a building. It's a cooling machine designed by people who refuse to take too hot as an excuse. And the closer you get, the more you realize how deliberate every single brick is. You run your hand across the rough surface. The mud feels sun-warmed, cracked slightly with age, but still solid. These walls were made with a special mix: sand, clay, egg whites. Yes, egg whites, lime, and ash. The result, a type of ancient concrete that repelled water, resisted heat, and didn't mind the occasional sandstorm. Inside, it's dark, cool, echoey. You walk down a short ramp, and the air gets noticeably chillier, like stepping into a cellar, where time slows down and your sweat starts to dry. At the very bottom, there's a pit. Not too large, not too deep, but enough to hold ice. Layers of it, packed tightly under straw and wrapped in burlap. Even after months, some of it's still intact. It's hard to believe, but this thing has no fans, no wires, no magic refrigeration coils, just physics. And more importantly, planning. Here's the trick. The yakhchal wasn't just a container. It was part of a full system of ancient climate control, starting with how they captured cold in the first place. At night, even in the desert, temperatures can dip drastically. So Persians built shallow pools, often right next to these domes, and let water freeze during the winter, just a few centimeters thick each night. But over weeks, they'd scrape it up and carry it into the yakhchal, like harvesting something precious. And that's when you start to notice something even weirder, the geometry. The yakhchal's shape isn't just for looks. That beehive-like dome is key to its function. The wide base holds the ice. The tall cone above it creates a pressure differential that pulls warm air upward away from the pit. Hot air rises, cold air stays low, and the thick insulating walls keep everything inside, deliciously chilled. Even today, architects scratch their heads at how effective these structures were. Historians still argue whether it was the specific ratio of dome height to base width that mattered, or if it was the wall material that made the biggest difference. One scholar insists it was all about airflow dynamics. Another claims it was simply luck and a lot of trial and error. You know what? Let them argue. You're busy enjoying ancient ice cream. Of course, the yakhchal alone couldn't do everything. It needed support. Enter the wind catchers, those tall, slotted towers dotting the Persian skyline like giant reeds. Wind catchers, or badgers, were genius in their own right. They'd catch the breeze, no matter how faint, and funnel it downward into the yakhchal. This airflow didn't just cool the inside further, it also kept humidity low, which is crucial when your enemy is melting ice. Between the yakhchal's design and the badger's ventilation, the Persians created microclimates, pockets of winter in a sea of fire. You shift your weight and listen to the silence inside the dome. You can almost hear the decades of footsteps, the quiet scoops, the laughter of kids sneaking cold fruit, the whispers of laborers layering ice like they were building treasure mounds. And it was treasure, especially for the elite. You see, this wasn't just a village gimmick. Entire royal networks of yakhchals once existed. Cities like Yazd and Kerman had dozens. They were often guarded, monitored, and strategically placed near palaces, baths, or important trade routes. Think of it as the original cold chain logistics. And while peasants might get a cup of chilled melon juice, once in a while nobility had access to frozen roses in syrup, fruit slushies, even meat dishes cooled before serving. A Persian banquet wasn't complete without something that made guests blink and say, "Wait, is this cold?" You smile at that thought, because you've had sorbet, you've eaten gelato. But this is a toothed and 500-year-old rebellion against the sun, a dessert with attitude, and yet, for all its brilliance, the yakhchal didn't rely on complexity. No moving parts, no fuel, just shape timing and patience. It's the architectural equivalent of that one friend who always stays calm no matter what. You run your fingers across a low shelf Where once blocks of ice may have been stacked for sorting, there are faded inscriptions here, perhaps instructions, or a name, or a tally of deliveries. You'll never know. But that's part of the magic, isn't it? This isn't a museum, it's a memory. And as you walk back toward the entrance, the air warming slightly, with each step you realize something strange. This ancient refrigerator, it still works. Not because of luck, not because of forgotten technology, but because people thousands of years ago believed that coolness could be built, not just endured, created. And they did it with mud. You step out from the yakhchal's hushed interior, and the heat hits you like a memory you didn't want. The sun hasn't even reached its peak, but already the sand is hot enough to make your thoughts sweat. Still, it's not unbearable now, because you know a secret, a trick. That dome you just left behind, it's whispering resistance into the face of summer. But the yakhchal is only half the story. After all, cold has to come from somewhere. You can't store ice unless you make it first. And here's where it gets even stranger. The ancient Persians figured out how to make ice without machines, without chemicals, and without magic. Just nighttime, and a solid understanding of how nature breathes. You walk toward a shallow trench flanked by low walls of mud brick. It looks unimpressive, like someone tried to dig a pond and gave up halfway. But this is the freezing pool, the silent partner to every yakhchal. Here's how it worked. During winter nights, the desert's dry air and clear skies allowed heat to escape rapidly. The Persians took full advantage of this. They poured water into these long, narrow basins, and under the right conditions, especially in January or February, the water would freeze, just a thin layer like a skin of glass. In the morning, workers would gently harvest the ice with wooden tools, stacking it and covering it with straw or thatch to protect it from the sun. Then they'd do it again the next night, and again, and again, until they'd built an entire winter's worth of cold, one sheet at a time. It's like watching someone save pennies until they can afford a house, except the house is a palace banquet, and the currency is temperature. Now, here's the part that makes your modern brain itch. Even when the daytime highs crept past 100 degrees, over 38 degrees, the yakhchal kept that ice frozen for months. That's not just clever, that's borderline sorcery. Historians still argue whether the key to freezing water in an open basin was the radiative cooling effect, where heat is lost into the atmosphere faster than it's absorbed. Some suggest they may have added salts or shaded the pools strategically to enhance the freeze. Others claim it was purely the desert's natural advantage: low humidity, high altitude, and wide temperature swings. Whatever the truth, the method worked. And it worked well enough that ancient Persian cities had schedules, a kind of ice-making calendar that was as reliable as the lunar phases. Farmers planted, merchants traded, and ice harvesters, they watched the moon and waited for the cold. You sit beside one of the trenches, the edge worn smooth by centuries of workers, resting, chatting, maybe sneaking a finger into the water to test the chill. You imagine the scene. It's deep winter, the desert is quiet, the stars shockingly bright. Men shuffle silently to the pools, their breath fogging the air. They check the ice, slide it into baskets, carry it to the yakhchal, like priests offering a frozen prayer. And, yes, sometimes it didn't work. Some years, the cold came late, or not at all. And suddenly, ice became precious, valuable. During those years, rumors of mountain snow grew louder. You've heard of spice caravans, silk roads, camel trains loaded with incense gold or lapis lazuli. But did you know there were also ice caravans? Imagine this, a team of merchants wrapped in wool cloaks, loading snow into insulated crates lined with straw and oiled hides, then strapping them onto camels' donkeys, or even sledges, headed not north, but south, into the heart of the desert. These caravans had to move fast. They traveled at night. They took routes shaded by cliffsides and watered at secret springs. Each stop was calculated. Every delay cost them melt. And when they arrived at the palace, if they arrived, they were greeted like heroes. A single block of snow dripping slowly on a copper tray might be worth its weight in silver, especially in years when the winter freeze had failed. Some scholars argue whether these ice caravans were common practice or elite extravagance, maybe both. But written records in Persian and even Greek sources mention snowmen couriers who specialized in delivering frozen goods. One tale describes a Persian general offering his enemy a glass of iced fruit syrup before negotiations. The message I have, what you don't, I can cool the sun. You stand and brush the dust from your hands. Even now you're sweating. The desert doesn't care how poetic the past is, but still, you feel a little cooler, because now you know ice in the desert wasn't a miracle. It was infrastructure, planned, managed, harvested, a dance between moonlight and mud brick patience and pressure. You turn back to the yakhchal. In the distance, it stands still, quiet, and somewhere deep in its belly, a chunk of ancient winter waits untouched, unchanged. And that thought, it chills you. You're still sweating, yes, but now it's the kind of sweat that comes with awe. You walk past the freezing pools, past the dusty basin walls, still faintly damp with memory, and follow a worn trail that curves toward the horizon. There's no signpost, but you know where you're headed, because to truly understand ancient Persian ice, you need to see where it began. Not with domes, not with pools, but with qanats. Now this part might sound dry, pun fully intended, but trust me, these underground aqueducts are the backbone of everything. You could even say the yakhchal is just the glamorous front of house. The qanat, that's the plumbing in the basement no one sees but everyone needs. A little downhill, You find the entrance, just a modest hole in the ground surrounded by crumbled bricks and tufts of grass defying the sand. It looks like a rabbit could have dug it, but what you're staring at is part of a 4,000-year-old engineering miracle. The qanat is deceptively simple. A mother, well often dug deep into the foot of a mountain, taps into underground water tables. From there, a gentle gravity-fed slope guides that water down into the city through tunnels carved by hand. No pumps, no pressure systems, just math pickaxes and centuries of grit. You duck your head and step inside. Instantly, the heat fades. The light dims. The air is cooler, not just cooler, wetter. The walls drip with condensation. It smells like stone and time. And this is where the yakhchal gets its water. Or, more accurately, this is where the whole civilization gets its water. Drinking, bathing, farming, cooling. The entire system is passive, which means it runs without needing energy, just earth and slope and patience. The qanats are so efficient that some of them are still in use today. Yes, today, in a world of smart meters and desalination plants, these ancient tunnels still quietly do their job. Historians still argue about who exactly invented the qanat. Some say Persians. Others claim earlier versions appeared in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but no one disputes who perfected it. The Persians took the idea, scaled it, mapped it, and nationalized cold. Because it's one thing to make ice in your backyard, it's another thing entirely to build a city-wide water system that supports ice production and storage year-round. The qanats were the arteries, the yakhchals were the lungs, and the people. They were just trying to keep their sherbet from melting. You walk deeper into the tunnel. A soft trickle echoes around you. Somewhere, water is moving. Not fast, but purposeful. In ancient Yazd, there were miles of these tunnels. Engineers, yes, actual trained hydrologists, kept track of flow rates, elevation gradients, and repair schedules. There were even inheritance rights because digging a qanat was expensive and owning one meant control. And that brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Ice wasn't free. It may have floated in public drinks and glistened in copper tubs. But behind every chilled treat was a hierarchy, a structure of access, labor, and land. You hear whispers, figurative ones from the past. Servants carrying melting loads on woven mats. Children forbidden from playing near the mother well. Nobles requesting a second bowl of chilled pomegranate seeds because, well, they could. One written record describes a royal estate with 7 yakhchals and a private qanat. Another mentions a tax dispute where farmers claimed they couldn't pay because the ice deliveries were late. Even in ancient Persia, it seems infrastructure delays ruined more than just dinner plans. But before we judge too quickly, remember this was a system built for survival too. Yes, the elite flaunted it, but even small towns had communal yakhchals. Even ordinary families, especially in highland villages, could harvest, snow store it, share it. One traveler's account from the 10th century describes stopping at a roadside inn and being served cold water with mint in the middle of July. He thought it was magic. It was just planning. You reach the end of the Connaught segment, open to visitors. Above you, a shaft of light pierces down from a vertical vent, a maintenance shaft, or maybe a secret well for drawing water without entering the tunnel. You pause there. The air is still, cool, not silent. There's always a drip, always a breath of wind sneaking through some forgotten vent. You think of the yakhchal again. It's no longer just a dome. Now it's part of a network, one that starts here beneath your feet, flowing quietly under sand and city-feeding dreams of snow in August. And as you climb back into the sunlight, blinking, sweating again, you feel different. You've walked through a system that reversed the rules, that said, we will not bow to the sun. We will store winter inside walls of mud, and we'll pass it quietly to our children. You emerge from the Connaught Tunnel with a new kind of reverence, not for emperors or conquests, but for the sheer audacity of ancient Persians. Imagine standing beneath that burning sun, staring out at the cracked earth, and thinking, not, how do we survive this, but let's have ice cream. And they did. You follow a narrow path flanked by low adobe walls. In the distance, a cluster of clay homes nestle like sun-baked loaves. Children dart between courtyards, kicking up dust. Vendors shade their carts with faded fabric. And somewhere behind a crumbling lattice screen, someone is grinding saffron. The air smells like earth roses and melted sugar. Because here's the truth, they don't teach you in school. Ancient Persian ice cream wasn't vanilla. It was falude, and it's unlike anything your modern spoon has ever touched. You step into a shaded alcove where an elderly man in a linen tunic gestures you inside. He doesn't say much, just hands you a shallow copper bowl. Inside, a tangle of translucent noodles, fine as threads, floating in a syrup that glistens gold. The scent is unmistakable rosewater, and tucked beneath the surface, shards of ice clink against the metal. You take a bite. It's cold, so cold it almost shocks your teeth, but sweet, slippery, floral. The noodles have the texture of something between jelly and silk. You pause, then take another bite, because this isn't just dessert. This is history served chilled. Falude or palude, depending on your dialect, is one of the oldest known frozen desserts in the world, dating back to at least 500 BCE. And it's not some royal invention. It was street food, festival fare, the kind of thing a kid might beg for on a hot day, or a merchant might slurp after bargaining too hard. You peek into the corner of the alcove where a large brass bowl sits nestled in straw. That's how they kept it cold, surrounded by ice from the yakhchal, then layered with straw, then wrapped in thick cloth. No freezer, no preservatives, just ice, sugar, and intention. And don't let the simplicity fool you. Falude wasn't made on a whim. It began with starch, often from wheat or rice, boiled down into a thick paste, then pushed through a sieve into icy water, forming delicate noodles. They'd mix it with rosewater syrup, often flavored with lime juice, sour cherry extract, or even ground pistachios. You want to laugh. Because, of course, they made noodles into dessert. Of course, they froze it with snow. They dragged through the desert. Of course, it's perfect. But here's the really wild part. Falude isn't just ancient. It's still around. You could fly to Shiraz tomorrow and buy a bowl for less than $1. Same basic recipe. Same shimmer of rose and lime. A line stretching back 2,500 years. Historians still argue whether the earliest versions of falude were sweet or medicinal. Some believe it was prescribed to cool the liver. Others insist it was purely for pleasure, what one poet called a sigh in a spoon. A few suggest it may have had ceremonial uses, served during Nowruz or weddings to symbolize freshness and renewal. Either way, it spread. By the medieval era, travelers from India, Arabia, even China wrote about a strange, cold Persian treat that melted in the mouth and smelled like a garden. You glance around. The elderly man has disappeared, replaced by a younger boy who tops off your bowl with another ladle of syrup. He nods once. You nod back. It's the kind of transaction that requires no language, just mutual respect for what matters when the world is hot. Outside the sun glares. But here, in this alley of shade and sweetness, the day bends. And if falude was the snack of the people, then it's no surprise that royalty went even further. There are records of Persian nobles layering falude with saffron custards, frozen yogurt, and crushed almonds. One tale from the Safavid era describes a dish served to a foreign ambassador, 3 layers of frozen dessert arranged to represent the 3 empires of the East. He was, according to his diary, completely undone. Same friend. Same. You step back into the street with your bowl half full, feeling cooler now, not just in temperature, but in the kind of way that comes from being in on a secret. Because this wasn't survival. This was style. This was an entire culture saying, yes, it's hot. Yes, we live in a furnace. But we also have frozen noodles scented with flowers. And you don't. You stroll through the narrow alley, still licking the last bits of syrup from your spoon, when the sound of laughter draws you toward an open courtyard. A group has gathered beneath a canopy of woven reeds, some lounging on carpets, others perched on clay stools. And in the center, servants move gracefully between guests, with trays of fruit drinks, and most impressively, ice. Not chipped, not slushed, actual solid ice cubes, glistening in hammered brass bowls. Here in the middle of summer, welcome to a Persian banquet. This isn't your modern buffet-style chaos. This is elegance with a master plan. You slip into a seat at the edge of the gathering. No one minds. Everyone's too busy being delighted. Plums chilled to near perfection. Melons sliced into crescents and set atop bowls filled with frozen water. There's sherbet. Yes, the original kind made from sour cherry pomegranate and orange blossoms. Not the sugary, scoopable stuff, you know. This is a cold drink halfway between slush and perfume, served in delicate glasses, fogged with condensation. You sip. It tastes like a garden in snowfall. You begin to understand. This is why the yakhchals existed. Not just to cool a glass of water or extend the life of leftovers. They were built for moments like this, occasions of power, beauty, and control over the uncontrollable. And this wasn't just for fun. Banquets were where alliances formed, where rivals were impressed, marriages arranged, and poets bribed with chilled rose syrup to immortalize the host's hospitality. A single summer feast like this could take months of planning. Ice was harvested, stored, rationed. Every guest might be offered a cold drink within the first 10 minutes, not because they needed it, but because they weren't expecting it. That's the point. You sit beneath the shade and let the conversation swirl around you. Flute players at one end, murmuring officials at another. Someone passes a plate of halva with frozen rose petals laid on top, like jewels. It's ridiculous. It's amazing. Because the ancient Persians knew what modern marketers still try to copy. Luxury isn't just having something rare. It's having it when no one else can. Historians still argue whether the greatest banquet innovation was the food, the architecture, or the ambiance. But many agree ice was the final flourish, the exclamation point at the end of a royal menu. You glance around and spot a small copper basin at the foot of a shaded wall. A thin sheet of ice floats on the surface, keeping a pitcher of grape must and vinegar chilled. Nearby, a guest scoops it into their goblet and offers it to a companion with a grin. It's not just refreshment, it's performance. The entire setup is theatrical, in the best way. Servants appear exactly when needed. No one touches their own ice. The host doesn't just offer you chilled melon. He waits to see your face when you realize it's cold. It's delight by design. And this design extended far beyond food. During the Achaemenid and later Safavid periods, elite homes had small cooling rooms, ice closets, if you will, linked directly to nearby yakhchals. Some larger estates even had indoor fountains with hidden channels feeding ice-chilled water through marble basins. Guests would dip their hands, exclaim at the coolness, and remember the visit for decades. Did you hear about the scribe who installed an ice fountain in his courtyard? Yes, he made sherbet by moonlight. This was the kind of story that traveled fast. And if you couldn't afford an entire yakhchal, you bartered, you borrowed, you bribed your way into one. Even small villages sometimes shared a single dome between households, carefully divvying out access like slices of cake. You sit back now, your own goblet slick in your hand, and watch the afternoon sun slide down the wall. A breeze rustles the palm fronds above. There's laughter again. Someone's telling a story about a lion, a tax collector, and a bowl of melting ice. You don't catch every word, but the punchline lands. The table erupts. There's something else here, though. something deeper. This isn't just a party. This is a statement. We don't fear the sun, these Persians seem to say. We cool it. We carve sweetness into it. We serve snow in July because we can. And somehow you believe them. The banquet winds down, but the story of the yakhchal is just starting to crystallize in your mind. Cold pun, fully intended. You wander back through shaded alleys and past rose gardens dripping with heat, thinking not just about what these people built, but how. Because this dome of ice-preserving brilliance didn't just happen. It wasn't the fever dream of some desert architect shouting, "I bet I can freeze water with mud." No, it was the result of calculated design, cultural urgency, and, well, really clever geometry. You find yourself standing before another yakhchal, older and more worn than the first. Its dome is higher, the slope gentler. A single crack runs from top to base like a wrinkle on a wise face. And that's when it hits you. These weren't one-size-fits-all. Each yakhchal was unique, tailored to its environment, altitude, and use case. This one, for instance, was probably used not just for storing ice, but also food, drinks, maybe even medicines. Let's talk structure. These domes weren't just plopped on flat ground. They were half buried with deep pits below ground level, some stretching over 10 meters down. The pit meant colder air naturally sank and stayed. The dome's conical shape let warm air rise and escape through vents at the top. Simple thermodynamics, brilliant execution. And those thick, thick walls, over 2 meters in some cases, made of sarouj, a special ancient plaster combining clay, sand, ash, lime, goat hair, and egg whites, because apparently egg whites fix everything. The mixture made the walls water-resistant, pest-proof, and insanely good at keeping temperatures stable. Modern materials, scientists are still trying to replicate it. They've even tested it against industrial-grade cement. Guess what? In terms of thermal insulation, sarouj often wins. Now here's a fun fringe tidbit for you. Some believe that certain dome ratios, the proportion of height to base diameter, were considered sacred, tied to cosmology, a reflection of balance between earth and sky. Do we know for sure? No. But historians still argue whether the math behind yakhchal design was mystical, mathematical, or just very practical. You walk slowly along the curved wall. It casts a wide shadow, no accident there either. Most yakhchals were positioned with east-west orientation, allowing maximum shading during the hottest parts of the day. Some even had double walls for extra insulation. And those who built them, they weren't anonymous laborers. Many were specialist guilds of architects and builders, like HVAC engineers, crossed with masons and a little bit of sorcerer. They understood airflow before it was science. They understood evaporation before it was chemistry, and they used it all in the service of ice. You step around to the back of the structure and find something even more fascinating. A trench curved and shallow, like a half-forgotten stream bed. This was part of the evaporative cooling system. Sometimes water was deliberately poured into narrow channels around the base. As it evaporated, It absorbed ambient heat, cooling the surrounding wall. It's the same principle behind sweating, except this building never gets tired and doesn't need electrolytes. You sit on a nearby stone, a breeze brushing your face as if the dome itself is sighing. Think about this. They built all of this before the birth of Jesus, before steel, before calculators, before the internal combustion engine. And yet, when modern Iranian architects began to design sustainable buildings in the 21st century, guess where they turned for inspiration here? To this humble dome in the middle of nowhere, whispering old secrets about passive cooling and the physics of stillness. You take a deep breath. The air is dry, yes, but here in the shade of the dome, it feels cooler than it should. You close your eyes, the whisper of wind through the upper vent, the soft scrape of sandals on clay, the timeless silence of something that still works. And maybe the most miraculous thing about the yakhchal isn't the engineering, it's the idea. That cold, this fleeting, delicate thing could be preserved. That you could build a house not for people but for a season, a literal shelter for winter itself. And the desert. The desert watched and shrugged, and the yakhchal said, "Try me." You leave the yakhchal's shadow and head toward a low-rise cluster of homes on the edge of town. No palaces here, no banquets, just everyday life, cracked walls, sun-bleached courtyards, and the distant hiss of water boiling somewhere behind a wooden gate. But you're not here for the houses. You're here to meet the wind. As you round a corner, your eyes catch them. Tall, narrow towers jutting from rooftops like chimneys with ambition. They don't puff smoke, they pull breeze. These are badgers, Persian wind catchers, and they're not decorative. They're architectural air conditioners that worked before Freon, before vents, before anyone ever Googled how to survive a heat wave. You step into one of the homes open to travelers, and immediately you feel it. The difference. Cooler air swirling around your ankles, the faint scent of damp stone and clay. Even in midday heat, the interior hums with a kind of breathable quiet. Above you, the wind catcher rises like a periscope into the sky. Its design, almost poetic, multiple vertical shafts with adjustable flaps that catch the wind, redirect it downward, and push hot air out like an exhale. And remember, this isn't powered by anything. It's just physics in motion. Hot air rises, cool air descends. Redirect the right currents, and suddenly a 40-degree day starts to feel like a shady riverside. Some badgers were unidirectional, built to face prevailing winds. Others, more luxurious ones, had 4 openings, allowing the system to adjust no matter which way the breeze was blowing. Think of it as a smart fan, built of mud and intuition. And what's more impressive, many wind catchers were connected directly to yakhchals. Yep, air pulled in by the wind catcher would travel down into the storage dome, sweeping across the ice pit and reducing humidity and temperature further. It was a ventilation loop designed centuries before anyone thought to plug a building into the grid. Historians still argue whether the inspiration came from Egyptian ventilation shafts or if Persians simply noticed how wind moved through canyon mouths and mimicked it. Whatever the origin, the effect is real. In fact, some badgers have been shown to drop indoor temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, enough to turn dangerous into delightful. You sit in the shade of an arched window, the breeze rustling the edge of a linen curtain. A child wanders past, carrying a bowl of something white and steaming. Not soup. Milk heated in the morning sun, soon to be cooled again in a clay pot nestled in crushed ice. This, you realize, is the rhythm of Persian daily life, hot and cold, desert and oasis, wind and stillness. You look back at the wind catcher and wonder how many people have lived and died beneath it, cooled by its silent labor. How many generations memorized the way its shadow moved across the wall? How many secrets drifted up those shafts and out into the dry sky? One tale from the city of Bam speaks of lovers separated by caste. The boy, a servant, wasn't allowed near the girl. But the wind that cooled her chamber, it passed over the courtyard where he slept. Every night he'd whisper poems into the wind, and the breeze carried them straight to her window. Do we know if it's true? No. But historians still argue whether these stories are metaphor or memories. You leave the house walking past a row of badgers that line the skyline like desert spires, and you realize something. In modern architecture, we fight nature. We wall it out, shut it down, blast it into submission. But here, they listened to it, shaped buildings around it, used it. Wind wasn't the enemy. It was the ally. It worked for them. And in that context, a yakhchal wasn't a standalone miracle. It was the final note in a carefully composed system of environmental harmony. The wind cooled the dome. The qanat fed the pool. The ice preserved the food. And all of it was powered by nothing but patience and design. No apps, no wires, just dust breath and genius. You step out into the alley again, the wind catching your collar, as if to say, you see, you don't need to conquer the world to be cool. You just need to build with it. You continue your walk through the sun-baked city, tracing the spine of ancient brilliance, one mud brick marvel after another. And as you turn another corner, passing walls that seem to hold memories in their cracks, something becomes increasingly clear. This wasn't just about food or architecture or cooling down after a long day in the bazaar. No, this was about power. Because in ancient Persia, ice wasn't just refreshing, it was political. It was status. It was control over nature. And more importantly, only a select few could afford it all year round. You walk through what was once the noble quarter. The homes here are larger, the courtyards wider. Many still have their own yakhchals, smaller versions, yes, but private. And that's when you realize these weren't just appliances. They were status symbols. the way someone today might show off a luxury car or a climate-controlled wine cellar. The yakhchal said without words, "I have access to winter. You do not." It wasn't only about consumption, it was about distribution. Imagine this. Two merchants sell figs. One offers them sun-dried, the other figs, chilled in ice and sprinkled with crushed rose petals. Whose stall do you think the satrap visits you? Pass what remains of an administrative building? Columns, worn smooth, an old storage room, still marked with charcoal notations. This is where ice was accounted for, weighed, taxed, and recorded. There were ledgers with names, amounts, dates. 2 baskets delivered to the governor's house, 4 amphorae of snow stored for summer wedding. Do not open before no ruse. And then there were ice permissions. Yes, some records describe licenses to draw from communal yakhchals. Certain families were allowed 3 scoops per week, others just 1. And some, especially temple keepers or apothecaries, had year-round access, supposedly for religious and medicinal purposes. Though let's be honest, that sherbet wasn't just for the sick. Historians still argue whether this system was fair governance or early cold classism. Some scholars point out that in certain provinces, ice was rationed equally during droughts. Others argue that it was almost always the rich who feasted, while the poor cooled their faces with clay fans and hope. You reach the remnants of a public square where vendors once gathered under makeshift tents. According to some travelers' journals, this was where ice was sometimes sold by weight, like gold, carved into blocks, wrapped in fabric, stored in pits or cooled jars lined with straw. One anecdote tells of a woman who sold a single lump of ice and made enough profit to buy a goat and 2 chickens. Another tells of a thief caught sneaking handfuls of melting slush from a palace delivery cart. His sentence: forced labor in a cannot crew, digging the very tunnels that kept the elite hydrated. Justice with a poetic twist. You stop beside a narrow channel lined with smooth stones, a runoff from a nearby wind catcher. It's bone dry now, but once it may have carried chilled water directly to the palace kitchens, the Persian equivalent of air-conditioned plumbing. It's funny, isn't it? You think of how we today keep things cold: Freon gas compressors, solar panels, electricity bills. And yet, 2,500 years ago, someone figured out how to make and manage ice in a desert using nothing but mud, shadow, wind, and skill. And when they had that ice, they used it to negotiate. There are surviving reports of emissaries from rival empires being offered cold drinks at the start of diplomatic talks: chilled pomegranate juice, mint-laced sorbet, subtle, delicious messages that said, "We don't just build cities, we bend seasons." One particularly bold account tells of Xerxes himself dispatching blocks of ice with official correspondence sent on camelback to distant governors as both refreshment and reminder. The message was clear: obey the empire that owns the cold. You look up at the sky, cloudless, white hot. You squint and laugh softly to yourself, because now you know the truth. Cold isn't just comfort, it's currency. And ice was a declaration. You keep walking, the gravel crunching beneath your sandals. Thoughts still chilled by the reality that ice, just frozen water, once moved kingdoms. But as the sun begins to lean westward, and the breeze stirs dust along an old road lined with sun-bleached bricks, you realize something else. All of this brilliance, the domes, the trenches, the sherbet diplomacy, only worked because of something most people never saw. Because beneath your feet, running silently, like the veins of the city, is a hidden maze, the Connaught Labyrinth. You've already dipped into one. But now it's time to go deeper, literally and conceptually. You stop at a low mound with a stone lip at the center. Another ventilation shaft. Just one of dozens, even hundreds, scattered across the landscape like forgotten footprints. You peer down. Dark, deep, cool. If you dropped a pebble, you'd wait 3 seconds before it splashed. Because the Connaught isn't just a pipe, it's a system, miles long, hand-dug, and astonishingly precise. Imagine this, a mother well carved into the mountainside, deep enough to tap groundwater. Then, a gently sloped tunnel descending gradually toward the city. Not too steep lest the water erode the tunnel. Not too flat lest the water stagnate. Now add vertical shafts every 20 to 30 meters, each one used to remove debris, circulate air, and allow diggers to escape with their sanity intact, all without the aid of GPS machinery or headlamps. This is handmade hydrodynamics, a feat so brilliant that many Connaughts are still functional today, centuries, sometimes millennia after they were built. Modern engineers study them with slack jaws, and when connected to yakhchals, these Connaughts weren't just water channels. They became climate infrastructure. Picture this. At night, cold air settles in the Connaught. During the day, that air is channeled through shaded tunnels and up into ice storage pits. Combined with a wind catcher, it creates a circulating thermal current, continuously whisking away heat and feeding the dome's chill. It's like someone built a refrigerator, powered entirely by gravity, airflow, and dirt. Historians still argue whether the airflow was fully intentional or a happy accident that got optimized over generations. Some say it was discovered when farmers noticed their clay jars stayed colder near Connaught mouths. Others believe it was always part of the plan, that the architects knew exactly what they were doing from the beginning. Either way, the results are undeniable. Records show ice staying frozen until late summer, even into autumn in some cases. You walk alongside one of the older channels, now its exposed trench shaded by crumbling clay walls. You imagine the workers, shirtless, covered in dust, passing water skins and tools in the dim underground air. One miscalculation, one collapse, and the whole system would fail. But it rarely did, because in ancient Persia, building a Connaught wasn't just construction, it was legacy. Families passed their knowledge down like sacred texts. Here's how deep you dig. Here's where the earth softens. Here's how you listen for water before you see it. In some villages, kanat diggers were so respected, they were buried separately, with prayers written in the same ink used for kings, because they weren't just laborers, they were cold bringers, life bringers, balance bringers. You pass a field now golden and rustling. The crops here thrive not because of rivers or rainfall, but because of this hidden labyrinth humming below them. Even the vineyards, whose grapes are currently being chilled for tomorrow's sherbet, owe their lushness to the slow-moving water beneath your feet. And when you consider it, all the mother well, the slope, the vents, the dome, the wind catcher, the sherbet bowl, you realize something humbling. The ancient Persians didn't just build ice houses. They built ecosystems. Cold comfort celebration, all woven together with dirt math and determination. You pause beside one final shaft. The wind rises from within. Soft, steady, cool, like a sigh from the earth itself. And for a second, you swear you hear something, not voices exactly, but echoes, of hands shaping tunnels, of families sipping frozen grape juice, of engineers smiling quietly as ice refused to melt in the noonday sun. You walk further now past the edge of the town, where farmland fades into dry scrub and the horizon stretches like a taut string humming with heat. There's little shade here. The air has that baked rock smell, the kind that clings to your clothes and makes your thoughts a little slower. And yet, in the distance you see movement, a caravan, camels, men in layered robes, bundles swaying gently with every dusty step. They're not carrying silk, not incense, not grain. They're hauling ice. Yes, ice caravans, a phrase that sounds like the punchline to a bad riddle. But here, in ancient Persia, it was deadly serious business. You stand to the side as the procession lumbers past, listening to the hollow thunk of hooves against packed earth. Each camel bears a wooden crate wrapped in oiled cloth, sealed with pitch, stuffed with straw. Inside, blocks of snow harvested from mountaintops or deep winter stores packed days ago, still cold, still solid, still worth a fortune. These caravans weren't everyday affairs. They were strategic deployments, organized with care, protected with armed guards, and timed with the precision of a surgeon's heartbeat. Because ice, once it started to melt, didn't forgive slowness. You trail behind the group for a while, overhearing fragments of chatter. Only lost half a block last trip. Stop by the South Yakhchal. First her wedding's tomorrow. Don't let the apprentice touch the crates again. Fool dropped one into a canal. And then, the phrase that catches your attention, trade it like silver. Spend it like silk. Because that's exactly what was happening. Ice wasn't just cargo. It was currency. Historians still argue whether the ice itself was valued more than the goods it preserved. In times of drought or intense summer heat waves, a single block could cost as much as a servant's monthly wage. More in southern regions where mountain access was impossible. Merchants would buy it low in the highlands, then sell it to city nobles who craved coolness in their wine. Pharmacists paid premium for it, using it to store heat-sensitive herbs or make cold compresses. Even sultans would commission ice journeys ahead of ceremonies, expecting deliveries, time to the hour. It was a balancing act between climate geography and logistics. And sometimes it failed. One ancient text describes a disastrous expedition where an early thaw stranded a caravan in marshlands. The ice melted, the camels sank, the cargo ruined, the merchant bankrupted. Locals would joke afterward. He tried to bottle a cloud. You pause beside a stunted tree and watch the last camel disappear down a low ridge. The heat presses in again. But the idea of what you just saw, that in a world with no cold trucks, no cryotech, no dry ice, someone still decided to haul snow across the desert, it leaves you stunned. And yet, not all caravans went south. Some came into the cities. Imagine this. It's late spring. You live in a noble house with its own yakhchal, but this year's ice harvest was weak. Your daughter's wedding is in 4 days. The guests will expect chilled apricots, sherbet, and falude. So, you hire a mountain guide. Send him north. He returns with snow, packed in sheep's wool and sealed in clay. You lose 3 servants to heat stroke, but when the dessert is served and your rival gasps at the frost on her fig, it's all worth it, because that's what ice became. A tool of theater, and not just for weddings or feasts. One 12th century poem tells of a dying nobleman requesting a final drink poured over snow from the north to remind me of my youth. Was it exaggeration? Probably. But you can't help picturing it, a silver goblet trembling in old hands full of cold that traveled days to arrive in time. Even commoners on rare occasions might save up for a sliver of ice during Nowruz, enough to make 1 glass of sharbat. They'd share it sip by sip, passing it down the family line like a relic. You return now to the city's edge, the sound of caravan bells fading behind you. The breeze carries a fine dust, the scent of dry mint. And for all the cleverness of domes and trenches and towers, you realize the most astonishing part is this people carried cold with them, not in the air, not in the soil, but on their backs across burning plains, down through cities, into the hands of those who craved something rare. Because in a land ruled by heat ice wasn't just a miracle of engineering, it was a miracle of will. The sun has dropped slightly now, still hot, still relentless, but with a golden softness beginning to touch the tops of the walls and domes. You follow the shadow of a wind catcher along a quiet path, led by the scent of orange blossom and the distant chime of copperware being stacked. This time you're not headed to a palace. You're headed to the heart of the home, the kitchen courtyard. And in ancient Persia, especially during summer, the kitchen wasn't just about fire. It was also where the coldest magic happened. You slip through a clay doorway into a modest courtyard shaded by latticework. On a raised shelf sit covered bowls of yogurt, bundles of mint, and a pitcher wrapped in wet linen. Beside it, a large clay jar sunken into the ground. You peek inside. Ice, crushed, packed around a bowl of what looks like stewed sour cherries. The house matriarch enters quietly, lifting the cloth from the bowl. She stirs the fruit gently, then spoons the mixture into a smaller dish already chilled from below. You don't need translation. You know exactly what this is. Sharbat. You've heard the word before. You've probably drunk its descendant. But this is the origin story. Sharbat was the drink of ancient summers, part refreshment, part ritual, made from fruits, herbs, and sometimes flower petals. It was chilled, using stored ice or snow, then poured over cool water or crushed ice like a primitive slush. It wasn't just a treat. It was a gesture. Guests were welcomed with sharbat. New mothers were given it after labor. Diplomats toasted to it. Farmers even offered it to the gods in small leaf-lined cups. And while the base ingredients varied mulberry, pomegranate, tamarind, quince, the ritual was the same: cold, sweet, offered with two hands. You take a sip. Even now, centuries later, it tastes like generosity. And here's where it gets even more beautiful. Every family had their own version, passed down like a poem, adjusted for region, for season, for personality. Some used rose and sugar. Others added vinegar and mint. One town even stirred in black pepper, arguing it balanced the sweetness and cooled the blood faster. Historians still argue whether sharbat was originally medicinal or celebratory, but most agree it became the symbol of Persian hospitality, cold, fragrant, and fleeting. You watch as the woman adds a second dish of ice, this time placing dates on top. It's a quiet act, almost sacred, because in this home, as in thousands of others, the ice wasn't taken for granted. It had been stored, protected, carried, earned. Think about that. Someone had planned this moment months ago. The ice harvested in winter, the yakhchal tended through spring, the sharbat ingredients dried and bottled. All so that today, this exact hour, you could sit under an apricot tree and drink something impossibly cool. And it wasn't limited to homes. Bathhouses, hammams, sometimes served ice-cold rose water after a hot soak. Schools had clay coolers where falude was sold in tiny scoops for 1 copper coin. During festivals, vendors pushed carts loaded with ceramic pots nestled in straw, shouting out flavors and clinking ladles. Ice had become not just a luxury, but a part of everyday joy. And perhaps that's the genius of it. Not just that they made ice in the desert, but that they wove it into life. They didn't build cathedrals to it. They served it in cups. A small voice at the door interrupts your thought. A child, barefoot and grinning, holds out a bowl. Inside, 2 pieces of frozen melon, slightly melting, unremarkable to look at until you remember what it cost to create this moment. You take one nod and sit back as the breeze picks up, because here in this unassuming courtyard, without palaces or fanfare, you feel the quiet heartbeat of a culture that didn't just fight the heat. They welcomed it, matched it, and answered it with snow syrup and the clink of something cold in a copper bowl. You linger in the courtyard as the last rays of sunlight stretch across the walls, casting long shadows like silk ribbons across the clay floor. The child with the melon has run off. The matriarch hums softly as she rinses bowls at a stone basin. You begin to understand just how deep the ice culture of ancient Persia really went. Because ice wasn't only for nobles or poets. It didn't just show up at weddings and diplomatic tables. It became woven into the rhythms of daily Persian life, and nowhere is this clearer than in the use of sharbat as a social, seasonal, and spiritual connector. You walk down a quieter alley now where the architecture softens. Simple homes, fewer domes. And yet, here too, you see signs of cooling ingenuity. At one doorway, a clay jug is wrapped in soaked fabric, evaporative, cooling, right there on the stoop. Next door, a shaded window holds a shallow dish of water with a bowl inside it. Basic physics, ancient refrigeration. No one here owns a yakhchal, but they've all learned from them. You sit beneath a fig tree and sip the last of your sharbat, letting it melt slowly on your tongue. And as the stars begin to blink into view overhead, you hear something unexpected, a voice chanting, low and rhythmic. You follow the sound toward a small domed structure at the edge of a garden, a shrine, and outside it, a small gathering of people, quiet, reverent, each holding a small clay cup filled with what you already know is ice water with mint. You edge closer, and someone offers you a cup, cold, sharp, and utterly out of place in what looks like a religious ritual. But here's the thing, ice was not just physical. It became symbolic. In Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of pre-Islamic Persia, purity of the elements was sacred. Earth, air, fire, and water. Especially cold water, which was believed to possess clarity, wisdom, and restorative power. Some rituals even incorporated ice or snow collected from mountaintops or stored in communal pits and offered at sacred ceremonies to cool the lips, to chill the ego, to remind participants of humility before nature. Historians still argue whether the water itself was considered holy, or if the act of preserving it in such heat was what made it sacred. But regardless, the effect was profound. You sip the mint water and let it slide down your throat. A man nearby murmurs a prayer in Old Persian, something about stillness and silence. and what lies beneath. And suddenly you realize the ice wasn't just a tool. It was a metaphor for control, for balance, for the idea that even in extremes, burning sun, endless dust, humans could preserve gentleness. You look around. No one here is rich. No one here owns a yakhchal. But every person in this circle is holding cold water because someone walked the mountain. Someone stored the ice. Someone remembered the ritual. And now, everyone drinks. That's the thing about Persian ingenuity. It wasn't hoarded. It filtered downward, like water, like wisdom. You leave the shrine quietly, stepping back into the now blue streets, and your eyes drift up to a dome glowing faintly in the moonlight. Another yakhchal, still standing, still cooling. You think about how it's weathered centuries, invaders, empires, earthquakes, yet it remains a monument, not to cold, but to the desire to keep something precious alive. And just before you turn the final corner, you catch one last whispered joke from a pair of elders. You know the real test of a host. Serving ice before the guest asks. You smile. Because that's it. Isn't it? Not just engineering, not just luxury, but a worldview that says if you're going to live in fire, you may as well learn how to offer snow. By now the stars have scattered fully across the desert sky, and the city around you exhales into evening. The heat loosens its grip. Doors swing open. Families gather on rooftops, and you find yourself in one of the most curious corners of Persian history, a place where cold meets the afterlife. Because, believe it or not, some Persians didn't just want to keep their sherbet cold while alive. They wanted to take it with them when they died. You follow a narrow path toward a series of ancient tombs, low and angular, half sunk into the earth, like forgotten punctuation marks in the landscape. There are no guards, no tourists, just silence and wind. You approach the entrance of one. The door is simple, the air inside already cooler, and when you duck into the dim chamber, your eyes adjust to reveal something unusual, not offerings of gold, not elaborate murals, but something architectural, a sunken floor, thick walls, and a small enclosed space off to one side, like a chamber within a chamber. It looks familiar, too familiar. It's a miniature yakhchal, not as tall, not as grand, but unmistakably designed to do what yakhchals do best: preserve. And that's when it hits you. This wasn't just a tomb. It was a cold tomb. Historians still debate the purpose of these frozen chambers. Some argue they were purely symbolic, meant to evoke the coolness of mountain caves where many ancient Persians believed the soul rested. Others think these tombs may have once stored actual ice or snow, intended to preserve offerings of food and drink for the deceased. There's even a theory that certain high-ranking nobles, especially those from mountainous regions, requested cold burials, associating coolness with peace. In Zoroastrian cosmology, heat was linked to passion, anger, even corruption, while cold signified purity, clarity, and transition. One unearthed tablet reads simply, "Do not burn, do not bury. Let me sleep in winter." And suddenly you realize, for some cold wasn't just comfort, it was eternal rest. You run your fingers along the chamber walls, thicker here than in most homes sealed with the same sarouge mixture. The air is motionless, perfectly still, and deeply, deeply quiet. You imagine a procession, long ago, family members placing small clay jars of syrup, dried fruit, maybe a shard of ice, wrapped in linen, a final act of care, a cold goodbye. Some historians dismiss this practice as impractical. Why waste precious ice on the dead, they ask. But that question misses the point, because this wasn't about practicality. It was about meaning. The same way we now spend fortunes on marble, headstones, eternal flames, refrigerated vaults. They chose ice, not because it was easy, but because it said something. It said, you mattered enough to keep cool. You deserved gentleness, even here. You were worth winter. You sit now at the foot of the tomb, watching shadows slide down the chamber walls. And you wonder, did this person eat falude under apricot trees? Did they have a favorite sharbat blend? Did they once help build a qanat, or haul snow through the mountains, or serve iced melon to a visiting poet? The dome above doesn't answer, but its silence is kind, complete. And somehow it makes sense that a culture so obsessed with ice, so brilliant in catching, storing, and sharing it, might want to hold on to that chill even after the story ended, not in fear, but in respect, in ritual, as if they were saying to the universe, I lived hot. Let me rest cold. You rise quietly, brushing dust from your palms, and step back into the night. The stars are brighter now, and in the stillness between breaths, the desert feels softer, less endless, because somewhere deep in the ground beneath layers of clay and time ice once whispered a goodbye. You leave the cold tomb behind, stepping back into the warm night air, which now feels strangely welcome, like returning from a dream to the hum of something real. The desert breathes around you, silent, alive, still watching. But there's one more stop on this quiet journey. A city, still standing, still cool. Yazd, you make your way along a dusty road toward one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, a place so dry, so hot, so sunburnt, it shouldn't exist. And yet, it thrives. Not in spite of the heat, but because its people learned how to live with it, and more than that, how to bend it. As you enter Yazd, you're struck by how strangely futuristic it feels. Narrow lanes wind like riverbeds between high adobe walls. Wind catchers, dozens of them, rise above the rooftops like sentinels. The streets are shaded cool underfoot and eerily quiet. And no, this isn't because the air conditioning's running full blast. There's none. This is all passive cooling. The same principles you've been walking through for hours now. Except here, they're everywhere. You step into a home. The walls are thick, over half a meter in places. The windows are small, positioned high, directing sunlight away, but letting in breeze. The floors slightly sunken, keeping cool air trapped where it matters. And just beneath your feet, the familiar whisper of Connaught water. You're standing inside a functioning ecosystem designed centuries before the idea of sustainable architecture ever became a TED Talk. And then, there it is, a yakhchal, tucked behind a modest courtyard, partially buried, crowned by a smaller dome. It's still in use. You peer inside. No ceremonial ropes, no tourists, no plaques, just ice. Real packed, layered ice. Harvested in winter, protected by wind catchers, served in kitchens, tea houses, and weddings now in the present day. Historians still debate whether Yazd represents the peak of Persian environmental engineering. Some argue that Bam, with its fortress systems, was more advanced. Others point to smaller, lesser-known villages that had higher per capita storage capacity. But Yazd has something none of them do: continuity. Here, tradition isn't nostalgia, it's strategy. And the ancient ways weren't abandoned when wires came, they were blended. Some homes now use solar panels, alongside wind catchers. A few restaurants have refrigerators, but still serve sharbat, chilled with ice, from the yakhchal. There are kids on e-bikes, zipping past domed rooftops that were drawn by hand before Aristotle was born. And it works, because when you respect the heat, when you listen to it, you don't have to destroy it. You can dance with it. You pass a tea shop where two elderly men sit in silence, sipping something pale and foggy. You already know what it is: dug, a chilled yogurt drink, made tangy with mint, and served icy cold in the evenings. A working-class classic, delicious, resilient. They nod to you as you pass, not as a tourist, but as someone who now understands that this isn't just a place, it's a philosophy. You sit near a fountain fed by Connaught water, shaded by vines, and rest your back against a cool brick wall. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughs, a wind stirs, and the city sighs with quiet efficiency, because Yazd isn't flashy. It doesn't need to be. It knows what it is. It is the proof, the living, breathing evidence that mud brick and geometry, shadow and slope, patience and planning can still outwit a 45 degrees day. And maybe that's the best part of all. This wasn't about rebellion or defiance or beating nature at its own game. It was about partnership. A people who said to the sun, "We see you, we feel you, and we'll meet you not with fear, but with snow." You linger in Yazd a little longer, letting the quiet confidence of the city soak into your skin. But now it's time to leave the oasis and trace the lines of influence outward, because Persia's ice genius didn't stay within its borders. It spread. And as you walk the dusty trade road stretching east and west, you begin to see the footprints of Persian cooling in unexpected places. First to the Mughal courts of India, where emperors demanded chilled rose milk on midsummer afternoons. They had Persian engineers design their palace ice wells, mimicking yakhchal geometry, thick walls, domed ceilings, deep pits. Some even imported Persian falude recipes, sweetened with cane sugar and topped with saffron, plucked from the Kashmir Valley. One Mughal text brags that their royal sherbet was cold enough to silence the tongue and humble the sun. Poetic, yes. Plausible, surprisingly, yes. You head further west now, into Byzantine and Arabic lands where Persians once traded ice across deserts and taught caliphs how to chill sherbet with snow from distant peaks. Arabic cookbooks from the 10th century include recipes for falude-like desserts, naming their Persian origins with respect. The word sharbat itself, Persian. You reach Cairo centuries ago where scholars translated Persian engineering texts and tried somewhat unsuccessfully to replicate qanat systems in Nile clay. It didn't work as well, but they tried because everyone wanted what Persia had the knowledge of how to tame heat. Historians still argue whether the Roman hypocaust system influenced Persian cooling or if it was the other way around. But one thing's certain, by the 12th century, wealthy homes from Baghdad to Delhi had yakhchal-inspired cooling rooms. Domes were built, wind catchers installed, cold drinks poured, and it didn't stop with architecture. The idea of cold as luxury crept into culture. You see it in poetry. A 13th century Persian couplet reads, "He brought me ice from the hills, yet I melted faster than snow." You see it in trade. Venetian merchants who passed through Tabriz wrote breathlessly of ice houses so clever, even in the worst heat, they served milk cold enough to numb the mouth. You see it in religion too. In Sufi texts, coldness is used to symbolize spiritual clarity, quiet, deep necessary. Hot is chaos, cold is divine understanding. And eventually, as Europe stumbled into the Renaissance, they too fell in love with ice. But they needed tools, machines, refrigeration. They built ice boxes, then compressors, then finally freezers. Meanwhile, Persia had already had all of that without electricity, without steel, without fossil fuels. And yes, eventually, refrigerators came to Persia too. The yakhchals faded, the wind catchers closed. In many places the domes were left to crack. Dust covered the pits. The old men who stirred sharbat, by feel, gone. But then something funny happened. Modern Iranian architects started to look backward, not with nostalgia, with need. Cities were overheating. Energy bills were rising. Climate change was making 50-degree C summers a reality. And where did they turn? To the yakhchal, to the qanat, to bajirs. Design firms began modeling apartment buildings with wind towers. Universities studied sarouj and found it beat modern cement for heat insulation. A 2014 study tested airflow models from yakhchals and applied the results to urban public cooling zones. It worked because cold, real, sustainable cold was never about the newest tech. It was always about listening to physics, to nature, to tradition. And now, from Dubai to California, architects are taking notes from 2,000-year-old domes. They call it bioclimatic design. The Persians just called it common sense. You stand now at the edge of a modern construction site. A student points to a diagram, a cooling chamber shaped like a yakhchal. He grins. "We don't need air conditioners," he says. "We just need to remember what we already knew." And that's it, really. Ice in the desert. Not as a miracle, but as a method. A collaboration between humans and the planet. Between heat and patience. Between memory and invention. You walk away from the blueprints with dust on your shoes and wind at your back, and you realize the future isn't built with plastic and plugs. It's built with mud curves and the courage to think slowly. You wander back toward the quieter edge of the city now, where light pollution thins and the stars reclaim their proper brilliance. Somewhere a yakhchal still hums its silent cold. Somewhere else, a family stirs ice into yogurt and mint, laughing at the moon. And here, as night deepens, the poetry of it all begins to settle in. Because Persian summers weren't just hot, they were strange, magical, and sometimes a little bit unhinged. You duck into a narrow side street, following the drifting tune of a reed flute. It leads you to a small tea house, its doorway glowing faintly like a lantern buried in sand. Inside, the walls are lined with books, carpets, and poetry, literally, quatrains and couplets scrawled across every plaster surface. You take a seat. A man in a vest and turban nods and sets down a shallow glass of falude without a word. You dig your spoon in and discover something unexpected. Grapes, frozen, pressed into the syrup like little amulets. The man gestures to the far wall. There, scribbled in elegant Persian script, is a quote, "The moon melted my sherbet. What did you expect from love?" You laugh quietly into your spoon, because that line, genuine, recorded, confusing, is from an actual 11th century poet. And it wasn't just him. Persian poetry is riddled with references to ice-cold drinks and the flirtatious disaster of heat meeting chill. She brought sharbat, colder than nightfall, and I forgot my name before the second sip. Or another, he tasted of mint and snow, a liar with beautiful timing. Historians still argue whether these references are metaphorical, literal, or both. Was the ice real? Was the melting romantic agony, or bad storage? Maybe the answer is yes to all of it, because the Persians didn't separate the physical from the poetic. They understood that cold was a mood, a metaphor, and a menu item all at once. One noblewoman from the 13th century kept a diary full of mundane details, grain prices, servant complaints, and long swooning descriptions of the texture of frozen peach syrup. She wrote about it like a lover, and in a way, it was. You finish your falude as the tea house begins to dim its lamps. Someone recites a final verse, half memory, half spell. Chill me, like the ice kept for kings. Melt me, like it never mattered. Outside the air is cooler now. The breeze carries not dust, but the scent of crushed basil and river stones. You walk through the near silent city and realize something odd. The hotter the day had been, the more beautiful the night becomes. And that's the core of it, isn't it? The Persians didn't pursue cold because they feared the heat. They pursued it because they knew it made the warmth bearable. That joy was not in the season itself, but in the contrast. A glass of falude isn't just dessert. It's relief made tangible. A tiny rebellion, a poem with a melting point. You stop beneath a wind catcher and look up at the moon. It's full tonight, white, round, almost like a ball of snow, slowly melting on a plate of silver. And somewhere in the breeze you swear you hear it, the soft clink of copper, the rustle of straw-wrapped crates, a whisper of saffron and rose water. Or maybe it's just the poetry in your bones now, lingering like frost that refuses to fade. The city of Yazd disappears behind you now, its dome silhouetted against the pale rising moon. The path ahead is quieter, emptier, but in your mind, 100 voices still echo. Engineers, merchants, mothers, poets, each carrying a sliver of cold through the centuries. Tonight, you're not chasing the chill. You're chasing the decline. Because for all their brilliance, ice cellars don't last forever. And eventually, even the mighty yakhchals began to fade. You pass through a village once famous for its communal ice pit. Now the dome lies cracked. The wind catcher slumps, leaning like an exhausted traveler. A goat chews lazily near the base of what was once a sacred vent. You crouch beside the structure. The saruj walls are flaking. Dust has filled the bottom pit. There's no straw, no ice, only silence. So, what happened? It started slowly. During the 19th century, European trade routes brought new technology, ice machines, mechanical refrigeration. Then, imported ice itself, harvested from American lakes, stored in insulated ships, and floated all the way to Indian and Middle Eastern ports. Suddenly, all that clever geometry, all that careful winter harvesting, all those sleepless nights stacking frozen sheets by hand, they were obsolete. The modern world didn't need patience. It had power. Historians still argue whether the introduction of electric cooling saved lives or erased culture. Probably both. Because, yes, refrigerators made food safer, medicines more viable, comfort more widespread. But they also made cold feel cheap, expected, a switch to be flipped, a hum behind the wall. You look around this abandoned village and notice how nature's begun to reclaim the dome. creeping vines, birds nesting in vents, time doing what it does best, forgetting what once mattered, but not everywhere. You reach another settlement, not far from Shiraz, where a local architect has restored the village yakhchal, not for nostalgia, for use. She tells you how her team worked from old sketches and oral history, how they mixed new sarouge using eggs from a neighboring farm, how they convinced locals to try winter harvesting again, just to see if it could still be done. And it could. Last summer, the ice held for 4 months. They used it to store medicine during power outages, to cool water for an elementary school, to make falude for a Nowruz festival. Kids lined up around the block, many tasting it for the first time. I thought ice came from the wall, one boy said, pointing at his house's freezer. You'd chuckle at that now, standing in the shadow of a half-forgotten dome. Because in a way, that boy's not wrong. The wall does make ice, but only because 1,000 years ago, someone in this exact desert said, what if the wall could do more? And sure, many yakhchals fell. Many qanats dried up, but the ideas, they never left. In recent years, countries like India, Morocco, and even Mexico have started experimenting with passive ice storage systems modeled after Persian designs. Zero electricity, zero emissions, just slope, shadow, strategy. You walk along a ridge where 2 domes once stood, one intact, the other flattened by an earthquake decades ago. The difference, the intact one had been maintained. That's the secret. Not that the yakhchals lasted this long, but that someone kept believing in them. In a world that loves speed, they were slow. In a world obsessed with scale, they were specific. In a world that said more, they whispered enough. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine it. The heat, the silence, the frost forming one delicate layer at a time under a starlit Persian sky. Not a miracle, not nostalgia, just a human promise. We will make it cold no matter how hot it gets, and maybe, just maybe, we'll remember how. The stars hang heavy now, thick as clustered grapes, above the desert road. You keep walking slower, quieter. The domes, the qanats, the sherbet bowls, they've all folded into memory. But the lesson of ice somehow keeps following you. You arrive at a low plateau where the wind is sharp and cool. Not by chance. You're standing above a seasonal ice harvest site. Yes, another one. Because yakhchals weren't just storage. There were entire landscapes dedicated to the act of freezing water in winter, deliberately, carefully, repeatedly. You step into a wide, shallow depression carved into the desert floor. It's framed by low walls on 3 sides, open to the north sky. This isn't a failed canal or empty wadi. It's a freezing field. Here's how it worked. During the coldest months, Persians would pour water into these open basins at sunset. By dawn, a thin layer of ice would have formed. Workers would crack it gently with wooden tools, collect it into baskets, and carry it to the nearby yakhchal. Then, repeat, night after night, sheet after sheet, building winter like bricks made of frost. This was slow work. Hands got numb. Sleep was sacrificed. But over weeks, they built up tons of usable ice. And they didn't just dump it all in. They packed it in layers, ice straw, creating thermal insulation inside the pit, sometimes with markers for future use. Ceremonial ice cooking. Ice, medicinal ice. Historians still argue whether the layout of these freezing fields followed local instinct or standard plans passed down by guilds. Some show perfect geometry. Others, more chaotic, hand-dug, rearranged over generations. Either way, you're struck by the dedication. This wasn't if we get ice, great. This was, we will have ice, or we'll keep trying until the sky cooperates. You kneel down, run your hand across the cracked basin floor. The texture is familiar now, intention embedded in earth. And you realize these people didn't wait for cold. They scheduled it. They hunted it. They shaped the year itself around the promise of that first clean freeze. Further up the plateau, a stone wall bears an inscription, not decorative, just a tally. Third ice, 9th day. It's not poetry, it's logistics. It's proof that cold wasn't luxury here, it was strategy. And what strikes you most is how unremarkable it all was. This wasn't seen as brilliant, it was normal, expected. Of course we make ice in the desert. Of course we store it. Of course we serve it. What else would you do? You stand again and let your eyes trace the ridges of the field. They curve like ancient ribs, a skeleton of a system that once cooled thousands. And as you turn to leave, you pause at the edge of the basin and glance behind you one last time. The wind kicks up. Dust curls. You almost hear the shuffle of straw, the creak of wooden sleds, the low whistle of men packing night frost into the ground. You smile, because now you know. Ice in the desert isn't luck. It's work. It's vision. It's quiet, deliberate, hopeful labor. A reminder that even in the most brutal conditions, people didn't just ask, how do we survive? They asked, how do we make it beautiful? And then they did. You've come full circle now, from the icy bowls of Falude to the wind towers of Yazd, from moonlit freezing fields to the hushed quiet of a cold tomb. And now, beneath a sky bright with stars, you stand alone. No walls, no domes, just open air and memory. But one image stays with you, that final bowl of Falude, half melted, half memory. Because more than the architecture, more than the science, more than the perfectly timed harvests and brilliant clay domes, what lingers is the feeling of it, the shock of cold on the tongue, the pause, the smile, the unspoken thought. How is this possible? You sit cross-legged in the sand, the silence wrapping around you like a thin cotton sheet. The desert, once a furnace, now feels like a cradle. and your mind drifts gently not toward data or engineering, but toward the humans who made all this happen. The builders who calculated slope with their bare feet. The workers who carried dripping crates of ice across days of dust. The mothers who stirred syrup into snow while the baby cried and the bread burned. The lovers who shared a spoonful under palm fronds. The elders who told ghost stories with sherbet in hand. The Persian relationship with ice was never just about cooling down. It was about elevating life. And maybe that's why it stayed, not just in domes or poems or restoration projects, but in people. A village child sipping sharbat from a clay cup. A grandmother telling you how they used to chip ice off a block with a butter knife for her father's tea. An architect in Tehran adding a wind catcher to a 21st century library. A street vendor in Shiraz shouting, "It's cold. I swear it's still cold." Because this isn't just history, it's heritage. And even now, in a world of refrigerated trucks and crushed ice dispensers, you can taste it. That trace of saffron, that shiver of snowflake on lip, that joy of defying the desert with a spoon. Because ice in ancient Persia wasn't an accident. It was an intention. Repeated, preserved, cherished, and now shared. You take one last breath. It's cool. It's quiet. And somewhere beneath the earth, a block of ice still waits, just in case someone needs it. And now, it's time to let all of that go. Let the images soften. Let the domes fade into dusk. Let the sound of melting ice drip quietly out of your thoughts. You're not in the desert anymore. You're somewhere softer, somewhere slower. There's no work to be done right now. No qanats to dig. No domes to repair. No sherbet to stir. Just breath, rising, falling like wind through an ancient vent. You might still feel the echo of cold on your tongue or see the flicker of stars reflected in a copper bowl. That's okay. Let it stay. You don't have to remember every detail. The ratios, the harvest dates, the caravan path. You only need to remember how it felt to sit in the shade on a day too hot for thinking and taste something that made you smile. That feeling, that little moment of impossible relief, that's all this ever was. That's all it ever needed to be. So, go ahead. Close your eyes. Sink into that silence. And if the world feels a little too warm when you wake, just remember, somewhere, someone once turned heat into a home for winter. And if they could do that, you can rest. You can soften. You can let go. Sleep well.